ask you guys to notice these two different groups of framing squares. And I would ask you guys to notice the distinct difference between this group and this group of framing squares. Did you ever wonder why? I'm here this morning to talk about something that is certainly very near and dear to my heart. And it's a bit of timber frame history, which I'm actually very proud to unveil this morning to the audience that we have on YouTube, and actually to the entire timber frame community in the United States of America, and in a way, the entire timber frame community in the entirety of the world. And I plan to unveil some factual history about timber framing that I don't know that has ever been explained before by anyone, either in the text of a journal or a letter or a book or certainly a video on YouTube. So I'm pretty proud that we have this sort of occurred knowledge over the past 40 years of timber frame, which comes from timber framing, which comes from experience. And what I'm really proud to explain to you this morning is not my opinion. It's historical fact, and I have the proof this morning to unveil to you. And it's something that everybody that's taken our class, which we've been teaching class since 1994. I have been timber framing here in New England since 1975. And yeah, I was just a kid in 1975 when I started. So I think there was a group of timber frame revivalists, if I could explain it that way, that sort of started to discover this forgotten art of timber framing in the early 70s to the mid 70s. And so that group of people like myself are now over 60. And I'm not saying that there weren't people before the early 70s who timber framed, because there were. And I know right here in our town we had a gentleman who timber framed through the 20s right up to the 40s. But it wasn't a prevalent thing. It wasn't your first building choice during that time period. However, since the group of revivalists that we represent, certainly from the 90s on, this has really kicked in to be something that's very popular and something that's very positive, and that would be saving this forgotten art. So when we teach our classes each year, I try and differentiate and separate, which actually is a fact of how they timber framed, or what their layout method was. It shouldn't be a gray area. It should be pretty cut and dry, versus my opinion on something, or what I've practiced for 40 years. And I try and differentiate the difference between those two, between students. The early timber framers who landed on these shores in the eastern part of our country were settlers from Europe. And you can't understand early timber framing in our country, and you can't get a good timber frame lesson unless you understand, Mitch, a little about our timber frame, a little about our country's history. So when the settlers came here from different places in Europe, such as Germany and France and the Netherlands and Spain, and first and foremost and predominantly, as far as timber framing goes, from England, they brought with them a layout system for timber framing which we know as scribe rule. And sometimes the facts and who uncovers something of historical significance sometimes gets lost by who really is the revivalist who brought that information forward. And certainly Jack Soban would be the person who brought forward the difference between scribe rule and square rule. So the two different layout systems, and Jack should be given full credit, as in my opinion he deserves. However, you can find a lot of information about scribe rule and square rule on the internet. But it's Jack, who is an original revivalist from the 70s, who first put into print this known written difference. In other words, to explain what the European settlers brought to this new shore in our country. So the French had a different scribing system than the English. Most certainly slightly different than the Dutch and the Germans. So that's just a quick explanation. So timber framing as it existed in America in the 17th and 18th century always had a European influence, period, up until the change. And that's what this morning's lesson is about. The change from scribe rule to square rule, which the historic fact is on the shores of New England took place someplace around the turn of the century. That's a historic fact, you guys. The turn of the century would be from 1799 to 1800. So that's a little bit loose. It could be 1798 that it occurred someplace. It could be 1790. In other places it may have been 1808 or 1810. The part of Connecticut that I'm from, which is the shoreline, I'm most certain that the change from scribe rule to square rule, which took years to actually make a complete transition, the first evidence of square rule timber framing here in Connecticut, which most certainly is no different than Massachusetts, Rhode Island, probably New Hampshire, happened around 1810. There's got to be some flexibility there. Could be 1806, 1804, could be 1812. But 1810 is a good place to hang your hat. So the turn of the century. Now, all this talk that I'm doing has to do with one very important tool, and that would be the framing square. And this is the historic fact that I'm happy to unveil to you guys this morning. This is just a simple, modern framing square, which could have come from your local hardware store or possibly Home Depot. This was made by Johnson Tool and Level, and it's made in the USA. It's a nice aluminum framing square. Now, if we look at this group of framing squares that I have here in front of me, these are all 18th century framing squares. And they're very early. And what I would like you guys, the audience, to observe is that each one of these 18th century squares is remarkably different than the one next to it. So the minor tongue, or the short part of the blade, versus the major tongue, or the long part of the blade, look at how on this handmade 18th century square, this appears to be about 1.5 inches or 1 3/8 inches. This obviously is 1.25 inches. This looks like it could be 1.25 inches or less. This appears to be 1.5 inches. So my point, and the historic fact that's in front of you, is that all these 18th century squares are different from each other. And most certainly, they're different from a modern square. All of the modern squares that we know would have two different size tongues. 1.5 inches on the short side, or the minor side, and 2 inches on the long side, or the major side. Every square from, certainly from 1820, certainly from the last century when they were made in a factory, they all had one thing in common. They were 1.5 inches and 2 inches. Now this is where the mystery and the historical fact becomes clear. So, I'd like to go back to these for 1 second and go back to what I said about when you're learning something from someone and they tell you that this square is from the 18th century. Well, how do you know that they know that? How do you know to trust their experience? Because they told you so? Well, a smart person makes an analogy of their teacher. I'm here to tell you that this square is dated, and it's how I've gained my experience. And I actually wrote the date here so you would know what this square is dated on the back. It's dated at 1765. I'm not sure if it'll show up here, where it's very clear who the maker was, and it's very clear that it was made in 1765. So how do I know an 18th century square? Because I have a collection of dated 18th century squares. And so I can identify how these numbers were hand stamped. Look at how crude the 7 is. Look at how crude the 6 is. There's a good chance that the 6 also was representative of the 9, Can you see how that's just backwards? Can you see how, or twisted from each other? Can you see how the lines are not totally perfect? The other thing you'll notice is there's no numbers on the back. They didn't care about having numbers on the back. This square had two functions for them. And believe it or not, maybe the least most important function in 1765 was that it was 90 degrees from each other. The most important function of this square is that it was their gauge or their layout tool. So whatever timber frame this square was used on, all of the larger tenons and mortises were certainly made this size, which if I measure this to show you, it's 1.5 inches. Now if I measure this other side, you'll see it's around 1.1 inches. So I can tell you from my experience that I have dismantled and worked with many early frames that have 1.1 inches or 1.25 inches tenons and mortises, not by accident. It's because the framing square dictated the size of the joinery that went into their building. Does that make sense to you? That way you would be using this as your gauge to making sure that your mortise was sized properly. You'd also use it as your gauge to make sure that your tenon was slightly undersized to your mortise. So another example of an 18th century square, which I'm happy to show off to you guys, a historical fact, 1795, Benjamin Bosher. Unbelievable, you guys. You know, we throw away so much early American tool, timber frame, building, architectural history. This, you can see the patina on this square. You can see that that's authentic. So the first part of my lesson to you guys is that I am able to identify an early 18th century framing square. Now you might think, big deal, who cares? But you see, the anatomy or the physiology or the mechanics of the framing square changed to this very modern Johnson tool and level framing square. And as I'm explaining to you, and I'm going to continue to prove, is that the change occurred at the turn of the century. That would be the 18th century to the 19th century. And also, what I'm historically describing to you this morning, which is not my opinion, but a historical fact. The change of the framing square is directly related to all the different areas and villages. The timber framers changing from scribe rule to square rule. Now that requires a little explanation. So, I believe that a very intuitive, either blacksmith or timber framer. Now because I'm a 40-year timber framer, I choose to think the intelligence and the intuitiveness went with the timber framer. Forgive me for that if you're a blacksmith. So a local timber framer went to his blacksmith and said, "Blacksmith, sir, I would like you to make me a new framing square, different than all the ones you've made your whole career. And I would like you to execute a framing square for me. I would like 1.5 inches on the short side and a 2-inch on the long side." And the reason, as I am an early 1800s timber framer, would ask for that is because he had thought of, if only we knew the original person who thought of the idea to switch from scribe rule to square rule, that person would be very famous. And I don't think we'll ever know that person or persons. It's probably evolved over a group or a local area, but they changed this framing square for a reason. To further my explanation, an 18th century, or better yet, a 17th century structure was built with European tools by European settlers right up until 1750, 1740, when we started to have maybe first and second generation young Americans who became timber framers. But their knowledge didn't come from somebody who was born in America. Their knowledge came from somebody who came from England or another European country. Their knowledge came from their timber frame master to scribe rule. Scribe rule timber framing takes approximately, I don't know what percentage we'd assign to it, 200 or 300% longer. Most joints need 3 trials. You need to try a joint, a scribe joint, 3 times before you execute it properly. Now, once you've executed a scribe rule joint, a mortise and tenon joint that goes together, you've only completed 1 joint in your frame. Now, this mortise and tenon have to go back together in the same spot. They were marked with a race knife. I can't make today's lesson involve a race knife. Take our class and you'll get the full lesson. But what it means is that every joint in a scribe rule frame took 3 tries to get it to fit right, only to be taken apart, scribed, and then the timber framer would move on to the next joint. So you can see how many hundreds of hours it would take to build a scribe rule joint. Now, fast forward to the very intuitive early 19th century, late 18th century timber framer. He had an idea, and he thought if he could convince all the other timber framers, he didn't need to convince all the other timber framers. He only needed to convince himself that if the blacksmith would make him a new framing square, then he had a new layout system that I don't know whether he called it square rule or we decided to call it square rule. Framing square, square rule. In a timber frame, we have queen posts and king posts. The king and the queen of England were rulers, okay? So, square rule, I think it has deep roots in English, early English, American English history. Scribe rule, square rule. King post, queen post. That's my opinion. That's not a historical fact. However, you may share the same opinion as me when I finish this morning's lesson. The second group of squares, framing squares that I have here, I brought over the one that was marked 1765. Once again, just to remind you guys of the difference between this 18th century square and these other squares. Now, we can see that they look different, and by part of my lesson earlier, I have this modern square, which of course stands out from these antique squares. However, it looks remarkably similar to all these. So, going back to a very intuitive timber framer asking his blacksmith to change the anatomy of the framing square and to make up a different framing square for him. If you're thinking why, what was the reason? The reason was because in a square rule timber frame, which is an American system of timber framing, in other words, early timber frames were built with a European layout system called scribe rule. We Americanized the process of timber framing sometime between 1790, 1795, and 1810. The change in the system, the American system that we call square rule, is directly related to the framing square, to nothing else, because a timber framer decided that he could standardize all the joinery. Remember the 18th century framing squares, where your framing square became your template, you guys. It became your gauge. They didn't guess about mortise and tenons fitting together. They used the framing square as their template. And I'll give you an example of that. However, here is a very early first generation framing square. And this is the proof that I have to you guys. Again, somebody's opinion versus historical fact. So you'll now notice that this almost 200-year-old framing square, excuse my math, this framing square is over 200 years old. Some of these early framing squares were going on 300 years old. Look how it looks remarkably like a modern framing square. It's 1.5 inches on the minor side and 2 inches on the major side. Now I want to unveil this to you guys and show you guys when this framing square was hand forged by a blacksmith. 1814. Now I'm going to go back to this 18th century one. Now do you see the difference? Do you see the change in the anatomy of the framing square? 1765, European scribe rule system. 1814, we've Americanized the process of timber framing to something we call square rule. Now, today's lesson isn't about the difference between square rule and scribe rule. We don't have enough time. You need to take our class. Today's lesson is about how the framing square was the major factor in changing the layout system. So here's the proof, 1814. Okay, 1.5 inch, 2 inch. I'm going to go through my collection here. I just picked this up last year, paid $350 for it. Why would I do such a thing? Because it's dated 1823. Here's the original date right here, which I made clear with masking tape here. Once again, you will notice that it's 1.5 inch and 2 inches. Okay? It's part of the timber frame revolution that occurred. Okay, there was a revolution in 1776, and in 1810 or 1790, there was an architectural revolution in these United States. The revolution was we switched our timber framing layout system from scribe rule to square rule, and it's based directly to the change in the framing square. I can't help my enthusiasm, you guys. So here is another example of a first generation framing square that would have reflected the change. Here you can see the date at 1813. So here's another example. You know, I have to show you guys, I paid $250 for this framing square. You know, if I had to guess, you know, how could there be more than 50 or 100 dated framing squares in the country? You know, there's some interesting research for you to do. Unfortunately for myself, I probably just exposed to the whole world that if you find a dated framing square, it has some value to it. However, I've collected enough of this and I have enough historic evidence. But once again, there's no numbers on the back. So the purpose was for the new framing square, again, which was different than the 18th century framing square. The purpose was strictly for square rule layout. I'm telling you guys, it's a historic fact. Now, I did save the best for last because, again, here's another modern framing square, 1.5 inch, 2 inches, just like the Home Depot variety, right? 1.5 inch, 2 inches. Much different than a scribe rule framing square, right? 1.25 inch, handmade, 1.5 inch. And again, if we go back to the 18th century squares, they were all different. Here is my earliest example of the change of the framing square. And if I could use a 4-letter word in excitement, I would. 1798, you guys. So this very well could be the most early example of the change in the makeup of a framing square in the United States of America, right? 1798. Now, it didn't change for any other reason, this is a fact, than how it affected timber framing history. So it's a timber framing revolution. It's the change from scribe rule, 17th century, 18th century, European technology. It's the change to American technology. A very intuitive timber framer, somebody whose name we'll never know. So I hope I've done a good job this morning getting out these historical facts about timber frame history, what I call the timber frame revolution. Okay, I hope I've done a good job explaining it. I usually only explain this to students in class. I'll tell you guys that I'm more than halfway through my book on square rule timber framing, which I believe will become certainly the manual for square rule timber framers for future generations. And it revolves around the framing square. But all that I've been talking about this morning is how we standardized square rule timber framing. So I want to show you what I mean. All of the storm braces, all of these diagonal braces in a timber frame are 1.5 inch mortise and tenon. Can you see that? Very much unlike this 18th century square, which you'll see is smaller. Can you see the difference? So this would have been used in a scribe rule frame, and the mortise and tenon joineries would have reflected the two sides of this framing square. However, after the Timberframe Revolution from late 1790s on, the framing square changed. So all your braces, can you see how you use that for your template? So when you make a mortise, there's no excuse. Your framing square should fit in like that every 1/4 inch. Can you see that? Now on raising day, you know it's going to go together. Now let me finish this quick lesson. Let's look at a tenon. Now, you use the same side of the framing square to make sure that your tenon is just slightly undersized, right? It shouldn't be 1.5 to 1.5 inches. Guess what? It won't fit together. So your framing square wants to fit in as you saw the example I gave you. That's for your mortise. However, your tenon, the word that we use is shadow. Shadow the tenon. So your fingers should communicate to your brain that, hey, I'm smaller than this tenon. And once you size all your mortise and tenon joinery to your framing square, let's put that Home Depot framing square down. Let's look at this framing square. 1798. I've just standardized all the joinery in my building. Now let's move down to this tenon. So there's 2 different size mortise and tenon joints in a true square rule timber frame. Again, I'm not talking about 1960, 1920, I'm talking about 1810. It was very common what they did with square rule timber framing. You can dismantle a building in upstate New York, or Rhode Island, or Connecticut, or Virginia, or Maine, and if it's a true square rule frame, it's going to have 2 size joints, 1.5 inches and 2 inch. It didn't change. Like Eli Whitney and the Cotton Gin, we made parts interchangeable. So this brace can fit anywhere in a square rule frame because we've used the framing square as our gauge, right? Because there was a revolution. We changed the design of the framing square. Now, the other size joint is 2 inch. So there's 2 different size joints in a true square rule timber frame, 1.5 inches and 2 inch. And as long as you make your tenons so they shadow the square, whether it's 1798 or 2015, it's 2 inches, boys and girls. So if your tenon shadows the square, it's going to fit in your mortise, right? If you use the framing square as your layout tool, you got it made. It's how to standardize the process of timber framing. So really quickly, to finish off here, there was a change in the framing square that revolutionized timber framing. We Americanized the process of timber framing, which is it's a well-known fact now, since Jack Sobin brought to light that there were 2 layout processes going back about 15 or 20 years. However, what I don't think other people have discovered, and I am very happy I was fortunate enough to make this discovery with 40 years of timber frame experience, is that the change from scribe rule to square rule is related to this, the framing square. And I think I've given you guys historical proof this morning, which I don't think you're going to find anyplace else in text, video, or any place in the world. So hopefully I've unveiled something that becomes a Northford Timber Framer trademark, something that we should get credit for discovering and bringing to light to the timber frame world. So, hey you guys, please consider taking our Northford Timber Frame class of 2016. And also, I can't help but mention the tragedies that happened in France. And I think peaceful people of the world need to stick together. And I also would like to say to all people in America, and instead of being in such a hurry to get someplace and do something, instead of talking about people bad all the time, instead of not giving somebody a break, you know what? How about you help out an animal at a shelter, help out a homeless person, do something nice for people. You know what? Timber framing brings out artistry in people. It should also bring out your heart and soul as who we were as Americans, as early settlers on these shores. So do something nice for the world, you guys. Be nice to somebody today. And Happy New Year. And we'll see you here on YouTube. Thank you very much. And then I got to timber frame my ass off.